Yes, but first, before we do that, we have to say that this is supplied by the Hidri family, David Hidri and his family, in memory of someone who we'll all be thinking of and remembering tonight, okay? Those of us
you got mail
who knew her, and we don't forget, all right? So it's very important that we say that before we begin.
I'm not hearing anything.
I think David is here tonight.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, he's right there. Oh, where was he?
I'm coming. Here I am. Here's David. Hi, Rabbi.
Okay,
I mute myself.
you heard what I said.
No, I was stepped away. No, I just walked back. I heard only part of it. No, say it again. Sorry.
John, would you like to say it?
Oh, I think I did, yes, yes.
Sure. Well, I just welcome everyone to another installation of Destination Torah. As Hakham had already stated, tonight's shiur is sponsored by the Hidri family in honor of the memory of Mariel Hidri, Miriam Bat Ahava. If you yourself would like to sponsor a shiur, my email is there. Please email me to make those arrangements. And all donations to Destination Torah through TCOMD are tax deductible. So if you're trying to round out your tax deductible donations before the end of the fiscal year, the link to do that is right there. All previous shiurim are posted on YouTube and Facebook, so please share and follow Hakham there. If you would like to order Alatz Libi Hakham Sidor, please email contributing Rabbi Stephen Golden. His email is there as well. And finally, the last link, there is the source sheet for tonight's shiur, so that everyone can follow along. And with that, as Hakham pleases.
Thank you.
We're going to begin tonight with a text from Maimonides, his great code, Yad HaChazakah. This is called popularly Mishneh Torah, because what we did last time, 2 weeks ago, segues right into this. We need to look at this text from Maimonides, because I'm sure many of us were very troubled by some of the things that we examined last time. We don't shy away from them, we have to confront them. But this text from Maimonides will perhaps help us counterbalance what we saw before and some of the things that are going to come later. So, sandwiched between last week's very difficult texts and a particular text that we have no choice but to look at tonight, we have this passage from Maimonides. Before we embark on it, we have to remember one verse from Genesis chapter 4, verse 26. We're not going to study it in depth tonight because I think it deserves much more time and needs to be studied in depth in its own right, and maybe next time we'll do that. Nevertheless, you will see that we will have to make a very brief reference to it in order to understand where Maimonides is coming from. With that introduction, let's launch from the English, because we can skip the Hebrew. The English, as you'll see from the ellipses, leaves out some parts which are not essential to tonight's discussion. But it's almost all there, but you have the Hebrew in its entirety for those who want to consult it. In the days of Enosh, men erred egregiously, and the counsel of the wise of that generation became brutish. The verse that I alluded to in Genesis says, "Az huchal likro b'shem Hashem." Right after the birth of Enoch, that's what it says, "Az huchal." And there's a huge discussion, what does it mean, "Az huchal"? And that's what we're going to look at next time. But for now, we just have to accept that there is such a tradition. That in the days of Enosh, something happened. And this is what Maimonides is describing. Their mistake was this. Seeing, said they, that God created the stars and planets to rule the world, placing them high above and giving them the honor of ministering before him, it is surely proper that they be praised and glorified and honored. This must be the will of God, to aggrandize and honor those that he exalted and honored, even as a king desires to honor those who stand in his presence. For such is the honor of the king. Wouldn't you say that it's almost uncanny how Maimonides addresses exactly the dilemmas of those authors that we looked at 2 weeks ago? But comes to very different conclusions. If you remember, both Nachmanides and the Zohar said that you have to show respect to the power that dwells in the wilderness, because the king, if you remember, it was all presented by way of parable, wants those great powers that he has endowed to be respected. That was, of course, the minimal view of Nachmanides. The Zohar went much further and suggested that that power had to be reckoned with, and if not, could pose a threat. That went way beyond. But still, both those texts recognized that God had given power to these various forces in the world, and because of that, we humans should also submit to them and show them worshipful honor, like sending a goat as a gift, or even more extreme manifestations of homage. And Maimonides starts off by saying this was a terrible mistake that they made. This whole line of thinking. Once this idea got into their heads, they began to build temples for the stars, to offer them sacrifices, to praise and glorify them in words, and bow down before them in order to fulfill what to their warped minds was the will of the Creator. This was the foundation of idolatry. So, idolatry is the will of God. We need to ponder this very, very carefully. Let's go on. This is what its adherents familiar with its principles would say. They would not say there is no God save a particular star, but rather was their situation like that described by the prophet Jeremiah. So what does Jeremiah say? Well, Mi lo yira'acha melech hagoyim, etc. Who does not fear you, O King of the nations? So this is a very important verse in Jeremiah. It starts off by referring to God as the King of the nations. Not the King of Israel, but the King of the nations, all the world. And then he implies, who does not fear you, King of the nations? They all do. So Maimonides says, they are all aware of that. For it is befitting unto you, forasmuch as among all the wise men of the nations and in all their royalty, there is none like you. But they're altogether brutish and foolish. The vanities by which they are instructed are but a stock. How did they get to that point? They recognize, says Maimonides, the existence and power of the Creator. Nevertheless, somehow their system degenerates into venerating a stock. It says in tree trunk. Probably meant a statue made of wood. As if to say, all know that you are alone, but their mistaken foolishness is supposing that this vanity is your will. So that's how he understands Jeremiah. But they all, yes, they fear God, but that fear leads them to want to obey him. And they think that in obedience to God, they have to also show respect to these minions to whom God gave so much power. It's extraordinary how Maimonides is able to analyze the thinking of idolaters. He knows they're not all idiots, and he understands how alluring this thought process is. And this is only the first stage. In the second paragraph, he proceeds to tell us what happens beyond that point. In the course of time, there arose among men false prophets who asserted that God commanded them, saying, worship yonder star and offer it sacrifices and libations and build for it temple and hew an image, so that all people, women and children, and the rest of the populace may bow down to it. Okay, so you see what the next stage is. At first, it was individuals who thought this out.
Oh my God, it's gorgeous.
Sorry? Can you hear?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So now there are official spokespeople on behalf of this religion, which first seems to have been, the way Rambam described it, something spontaneous. You remember? People began to think along those lines. But now, he says, in the course of time, there arose false prophets. And now it became a much bigger movement, because he's saying, God commanded them, saying, worship yonder star. It's not just an assumption that they say, well, it stands to reason. That's what happened above. Now, no, now they get a message and a commandment. Their priests, moreover, would say to them, by this worship you will flourish and succeed. Do thus and such, but not that and this. Now, of course, we understand that at this point, the battle was lost, or won, if you like. The priests have won, and those who are against idolatry have lost, because this is the great power of the priests. By this worship you will flourish and succeed. Maimonides is echoing the biblical report of the very words that were uttered by those who sacrificed to the Queen of Heaven, right? They said, as long as we sacrifice to the Queen of Heaven, the very words, we had plenty of bread and our lives were good and we lacked nothing. So they've been talked into believing that there's a correlation between the idol worship and success on earth. Do thus and such, but not that and this. So now the priests have power over them and can tell them what to do, what not to do. Because if you want to flourish, then you have to do X, Y, and Z. And if you do another list, which they provide them with, then you will fail and suffer. Then still other frauds rose up to assert that the star itself, or the planet, or the angel spoke to them and instructed them, saying, worship me thus and such. Do so, but do not do so. So now there are people speaking on behalf of those false gods. In the beginning, the first generation, or the first, if you like, the first set, if you like, of prophets, they said they're speaking on behalf of the true God. But later down the line, they started offering and bringing messages on behalf of the false gods. The worship of images with varied rituals, including sacrificing and bowing, spread throughout the world. Eventually, the glorious and awesome name, capital name, lapsed from the mouths and minds of mankind, and nobody knew him, except for a few individuals. This is how the world drifted along. An interesting word he uses, it's galgal, like a ball rolling along, nothing to stop it, because it's inertia. So just continues. The Talmud says, Hakham shebechutz ha'aretz, lav ovdei avodah zarahem ela minhag avotehem b'dehem. This is not in the text. I'm just reminded of it. Talmud says, throughout the world, you'll find many idol worshippers who don't really think about it at all. But if you ask them why they do it, they say it's the tradition. Minhag. Minhag, we have to follow the tradition of our ancestors. So that's what the Rambam is saying. They drifted along with galgal. They're not thinking anymore, not questioning anything. That's the way things are done. That's the status quo. Until the birth of that firmest pillar of the world, our ancestor, Abraham. And then, of course, Maimonides goes on to describe the great revolution that Abraham introduced and how he didn't just discover or rediscover God, but he preached God everywhere and spread his faith, and of course, according to the Talmud, made many converts, great numbers. He and Sarah together, that was their great mission, to go and convert people away from the idolatry by talking to them, discussing things with them, and raising questions, not through fighting or imposing things. One Agadah says, Rambam gives a variety of Agadot, or bases his description on these Agadot. Some say that he planted an eshel, a great tree, and he would invite people to come and have a meal. And after they had a meal, they would thank him, and he would say, "Don't thank me, thank the one who provides me with all this food." And they would say, "Who provided you?" And then he would start introducing them to the faith. And then they would say, "You're right, we'll join you in saying a bracha." And that was the beginning of their conversion. He shared the Lord's name with everyone. Vayikra Sham Abraham B'Shem Hashem. He declared God's name wherever he went. If you remember, a few sentences before, Maimonides said, the awesome name lapsed from the mouths and minds of mankind, and nobody knew him. They were not allowed to speak about it. In our day, there are those who say, don't speak God's name anywhere in the world because the nations, we want them to follow their idols. And some of them actually take a verse from our Torah and distort it and twist it so that it supports that view. They are not on the side of Avraham Avinu, nor on the side of Maimonides, nor on the side of any of the best teachers of our past history. But just be aware that there are some who are trying to inculcate this message. Okay. Now we make a sharp turn to a very different topic. I'll tell you how we got there. I had mentioned last time that we should allow any text that we're going to discuss to speak for itself and to bear witness for itself, because the Torah says, Al pi shenaim edim yakum davar. On the evidence of two witnesses shall anything at all be established. So we had to find a second text from the Zohar, because we only had one last time. So you can toss a coin and take any text from the Zohar, but it occurred to me, why not take something from the parasha of the week? So since we're in Parashat Vaychi, seemed to be proper and appropriate to take something out of Zohar on the week's parasha. So I read a great part of it, starting at the beginning, and not everything seemed suitable. Some parts are very long and unwieldy. So I chose something that is more or less self-contained, and also it has a bearing on a verse which has been dealt with by many, many commentators. So I thought this would be useful to be able to compare and contrast the different ways in which this verse had been treated down the ages. So we first look at the verse. It's Genesis 47:31. So the story was that as Jacob was growing old, he wanted to instruct his son Joseph with his last wishes. And he tells him what he wants. And then, this is the verse where we meet him, verse 31, Jacob says to his son Joseph, "Swear to me that you'll do what I request." So it doesn't give a name in this verse because before it was talking about Jacob and Israel. These are his two names. So in the verse, it's just a pronoun. He said, "Swear unto me." So he swore the oath. That's Joseph. And Israel bowed or prostrated himself at or on the head of the bed. Now you'll see here we have optional translations for two of the terms. First is vayishtachu. Now this is the hitpa'el, if you'll forgive a moment of grammar, just so that we know why there are some issues here. So shachu is the kal, and it occurs a few times in the Bible. Shachu givot olam, right? Alichot olam lo, in, where is it, in Habakkuk? He says, the ancient mountains were lowered or dipped or diminished. And then you also have Vayishach Adam Vayishpal Ish, which is even more helpful, because there you have Vayishach and Vayishpal in more or less in apposition. So it tells us what it means. They lower themselves, Vayishach. Or they will be lowered, perhaps. But Vayishtachavu probably means they lower themselves. So that's agreed by everyone. The question is, what form did this lowering take? Was it just a bow of the head? Well, that's lowering because a person's stature is lowered. If his head is folded over, so he's a few inches shorter. So many think that nishtachavot means to bow. And others think it means to prostrate, go down on the ground and prostrate themselves, as some do on Kippur to this day, during the prayer called the Avodah, or reenactment of the temple service. So in many communities, not many, they reenact it by prostrating themselves on the floor. So there's a disagreement as to what it means. I'm inclined to say bow is good enough, because in many, many texts, actually, it doesn't mean much more than bowing. Nothing as strenuous as prostrating oneself on the floor. And the next question is, al rosh hamita. So al can mean at or on. We have to try, though, and get a mental image of what was going on here. What does it mean? He bowed at the head of the bed. Simple meaning seems to be that he was laid up. He wasn't yet sick per se, but he seems to have been very elderly, because he says that he felt that the end was close. And that's why he called for his son Joseph to give his last wishes and make them clear. So it says, Vayikrevu im Yisrael lamut. So he felt that this is it. He's had a very long life, and now it's time to say farewell. And therefore, it's quite natural that he would have been sitting in bed, and then he bowed. To whom was he bowing? So that is the biggest debate among the commentators. So the first one we look at is Rashi. So Rashi divides his comments in two parts. First, he deals with the bowing. And he says, as the maxim goes, Though the lion is king, when the fox has his time, bow to him. What's that supposed to mean? Joseph is now in charge. That's how this maxim is usually explained. And therefore, show respect to this royal personage. Okay? He is the official viceroy, if you like, of the king of Egypt. So you owe him a certain respect. Incidentally, we have to remember that so much of what we saw in the Rambam, what we saw last week, in these parables of people blundering on this very point, when they say to themselves, as the Rambam puts it, well, the great God shows so much regard for these creations of his. Look at the power he's bestowed upon the sun and the planets. Therefore, we should respect them as well. It all comes from court etiquette and protocol, because the king of flesh and blood does expect that the subjects show deference to his ministers and to those whom he has given authority. We see it here, and we see how those parables were extrapolating from palace protocol. And that's always very risky. How did it start? It starts with language. And I want to say this now because we're going to need to come back to it very shortly. Language is a very powerful tool, but we must respect it. If we want to play games with it, that's fine. We can play Scrabble or any game we want. But if we're going to use it as a tool to convey sense, then we have to respect words and their definitions as best we can. And that is not the time to play games. Why am I saying this? When people spoke of Hashem, they needed to fall back on conventional language. That's all we have. And so they used what's called anthropomorphisms. And at some point, one of the favorite anthropomorphisms to address God was king. Now it's very interesting that neither our father Abraham, nor for that matter Moses, addresses God as king. Yes, we have Hashem Yimloch Le'olam Wa'ed as a verb in Exodus. And some think that in Moses' blessing, Vahi Bishurun Melech refers to God. But that is, again, contested. It may be, it may not be. So that was not in a prayer. He never addressed God directly as king. But later, we find this is very, very common. And some think it's after Israel had a monarchy, and they were used to kings, and the king was at the pinnacle of society. So this became an appropriate appellation which to address God. It was only figurative, but they used it. There was nothing wrong with that, because everyone knew it was figurative. But in later times, we find something quite dangerous happens. They're really looking at kings and potentates all around, and then likening God to those tyrants. In fact, in some of these parables, you'll be quite shocked to see the kind of things they say. In one place even, you'll read an Agadah, which goes like this. If a king and queen were in conversation and somebody walked between them, that person would lose his head. And then they say, well, the same, chas v'shalom, it's so blasphemous, God would act the same way. I mean, it's so outrageous and so frightening how people can be led and dragged by a word. It's only a word. We're only using it, as the rabbi said, lisaber et ha'ozen, because that's all we have. That's all we have is language. But when a word becomes unhelpful and takes on a life of its own and tries to dominate, then we have to move away from it and not use it so much. In fact, today, monarchy doesn't represent what it did once upon a time. So it's pretty innocuous. So some people feel today it's quite harmless and we can use the word king with much less compunction. However, those stories and fancies that were formulated at a time when king had a very bad connotation, those we have to reject without any ifs or buts, like the one that I just cited to you. It has no place in our vocabulary, and we have to say a very distinct and deliberate and unequivocal no. Because language is important, but again, it cannot dominate our thought and certainly not our faith. So we have to have that little diversion, partly because of what we're reading now, but partly because of what's coming. Now we go on to the second part of Rashi. On the bed's head, he turned towards the Shekhinah. The rabbis inferred from this that the Shekhinah is above the pillow of a sick person. In parentheses, it says, see Shabbat 12 and Nedarim 40b. Actually, when you look up there, you will find it does say that the Shekhinah is above the pillow of a sick person, but it does not derive it from this verse at all. It derives a very different verse. So it's surprising that Rashi would say this is where the rabbis derived it from. Anyway, we're going to get to the actual text of the Talmud, at least one of them, Shabbat 12b, in a moment. Now we come to Ibn Ezra. What does he have to say about the bowing at the head of the bed? Israel bowed as a gesture of respect for royalty. So just like Rashi, his first interpretation corresponds exactly to Rashi's first comment. But what seems correct in my eyes is that he was expressing praise to Hashem. And it is not comparable to Abraham's bowing, which was specifically to the children of Chet. So Ibn Ezra, as always, is very brief and cryptic. So he says he doesn't agree with the first interpretation. That is commonly given, that it was respect for royalty, but he says, to me, it seems that he was bowing to God in thanksgiving. Sephorno, doesn't find any ambiguity here at all. He says, right out, to thank his creator for enabling him to exact this promise from his son. We find that Abraham's steward, after hearing that Rebekah's family agreed that he take her as a wife for Isaac, reacted in similar fashion. He bowed to Hashem when he heard the good news. He was thankful that his wish had been granted. And Sephora says exactly the same here. So he doesn't even entertain the first idea of Rashi and of Ibn Ezra. He cuts it out completely. Now we come to the Talmudic passage from Shabbat, which actually says that the Shekhinah is present at the side of a patient. Rabbi Bar Chana said, when we would go with Rabbi Elazar to visit a sick person, we noticed that sometimes he said, may God remember you for peace, in Hebrew. And sometimes he said, may the merciful one remember you for peace, in Aramaic. So that's the story as reported by Rabba, the grandson of Hannah. But then the Talmud objects, as usual, raises a kushya. How could he have done this? To pray in Aramaic. Didn't Rabbi Yehuda say one should never request one's needs in Aramaic? And Rabbi Yochanan said, if people request their needs in Aramaic, the ministering angels pay them no attention, because the ministering angels do not know Aramaic. What on earth are they talking about? Well, first of all, it's obvious that Rabbi Bar Chana didn't see a problem with the story, nor did Rabbi Elazar. But there were others who had this belief, A, that somehow ministering angels are involved in the transmission of intercessory prayer made by human beings and the divine addressee. This is a most extraordinary statement. Where are they coming from? We've never heard of this anywhere else. This is quite a unique idea. There are all kinds of theories of where it comes from. The best theory I can give you, because it's the only rationalist one, or the only rational one even, and it's this, that Rabbi Yehuda the Patriarch did not like Aramaic. He was all for speaking either Hebrew or Greek. Those are the two languages he spoke very well, and the Mishnah is in pure Hebrew, not biblical Hebrew, but still it's in Hebrew, not Aramaic. He shunned Aramaic and called it sursi, which is a pejorative word. And most likely, those who belonged to his school tried to discourage prayer in Aramaic. But they weren't too successful because that was the spoken language. And that came naturally to people. It was only the very educated who knew Hebrew and Greek. But the hoi polloi definitely spoke Aramaic. We know this, that the Torah had to be translated into Aramaic so that the congregants on a Shabbat would understand what's being read in the Torah. They really didn't know Hebrew. But those purists who wanted Hebrew to reign and to put a stop to the popular practice of Aramaic, they told people, don't pray in Aramaic. And then somebody else added, in order to scare them, tell them you better stop, the ministering angels whom the ordinary people unfortunately believed in will not be able to deal with your prayers, and they won't go up to heaven. Now this is so sad that they had to accede to such common superstitions. But that's what happens. And you can't blame rabbis, because today as well, we all know this, that sometimes one has to be a little bit accommodating. To get a message across, we have to speak the common language and even say things which maybe would be better unsaid. Nevertheless, we shouldn't be harsh on those who do it, because they do it in a good cause. And in order to cajole people, they have to sometimes speak that common tongue. Okay, enough on that. Let's go on. So now the Talmud have to harmonize between these two, between the tradition of Rabbi Rachanan ben Azar, who had no problem praying in Aramaic, and this other tradition which said, don't pray in Aramaic. So what's the answer? The sick are different, because the Shekhinah is with them. As Rab Anan said in the name of Rav, from where is it derived that the Shekhinah supports a sick person? For it is stated, the Lord will support him on his sick bed, and so on. So the answer is that maybe under other circumstances, prayers depend on the ministrations of angels. And if they don't understand, they're not able to transmit it to on high. But at the side of the sick bed, the Shekhinah itself is present. So we short circuit the angels, and we can tell them to get lost when we're praying for the sick, because God is always with those who are lowly and in trouble. This is a very beautiful idea. Of course, it comes from the Psalms, from the prophet, and the verse that is quoted here specifically is from the Psalms. Nothing to do with Jacob on his sickbed. We're going to look now at verse from Psalms. The rest of the passage in the Talmud, we don't have to read every word of it. It just confirms this idea that the Bible teaches God is with those who are suffering in sickness. And now we come to the verse. That's item number 5. First, I'll read it in Hebrew because I want to point out one word here that is quite rare in the Bible and therefore lends itself to some debate. Hashem yis'adenu al eres devai kol mishkavo hafachta bechol yom. This word yis'adenu, what does it mean? We know in Aramaic and in rabbinic parlance, seudah is a meal, food, physical food, grub. Yeah. And in the Bible, we know that Abraham told his visitors, go and sit under the tree, sa'adu lebechem. Feed yourselves, nourish yourselves, something like that. Also in the Psalms, v'lechem v'vavenosh yis'ad. Bread sustains, nourishes a person. So it seems to have various meanings, different shades of meaning, but they all boil down to one thing: nourishing, sustaining. And in this context, we see the New English Bible, I think, chose a good term, nurses him, because that's what has to be done for a person who's lying on a sick bed. It's not feeding, maybe giving him a huge hearty meal like Abraham gave his guests, wouldn't be the best thing for him or her. So I think nurses is an excellent translation. The Lord nurses him on his sick bed. All his couches he reverses in his illness. That's slightly idiomatic. The mishkavo hafachta. Hafachta, some say turns, but no, hafachta means reverses. Just like hafachta misbedir emacholdi, it's reversed. So the person is lying on his bed, and it's going to be a reversal. He's not going to need to be lying on his bed. He's going to stand up and be cured. So it's a beautiful verse, this image of the Lord nursing the sick in his bed. And of course, it's in the Amidah, Baruch Atah Hashem, Rafeh Cholim. We say that God is the healer of the sick. Now, of course, we know there are those who invariably come up with the cynical remark, well, who makes people ill in the first place? And I say to them, the Bible has already taken care of that. Ani amit va'achaye v'achatzti va'ani erpa. I both give life and take life. V'achatzti. I afflict and I heal. Both. We don't say God only heals. We already learned this 2 weeks ago. God says, I create Ra. I create those things that are good and those things that are not good. They all come from one God. We think of them as not good because sometimes they're painful and difficult for us. But the Torah teaches they all come from God. This is not what it's talking about. It's not saying here simply that God heals the sick. It's saying something much more profound. When evil comes, it doesn't say that God is present. The Talmud says the Shekhinah stands with the sick person to nurse and support him or her. It's a completely different thing. In other words, God is revealing that he wants us to have this image of him at the side of those who are sick, supporting them. Yes, he has given the sickness and he will or will not give the healing. Jacob was not healed. He died soon after. But the Shekhinah is there with him, holding his hand. It's an extraordinarily anthropomorphic statement, but a very, very profound one, and it goes to the very heart of Torah and Talmud. Now, lastly, we come again to the Zohar text. This is the Zohar text. Now, it may be shocking to some, but it is what it is. Dealing with the same verse from the parasha, not with the Psalms, but it assumes that statement that the Shekhinah is with the sick person. But it takes that magnificent teaching of the Bible and the Talmud and distorts it into something which is really very shocking, but we have to grit our teeth and just go through it. And Israel bowed upon the head of the bed. The bed's head is the Shekhinah. That's how it starts. Said Rabbi Simeon, heaven forbid. Rather did he kneel and bow to himself. He did not. In other words, he's saying he did not bow to the Shekhinah. He bowed to himself. What does that mean? So you have to understand Kabbalistic lingo. Israel equals Tiferet, which the Zohar places higher than the Shekhinah. So next time, in order to understand this whole rigmarole of language, we will look at dictionary definitions of Kabbalistic terminology. But for now, we only need to know this one definition. They had 10 Sephirot, and they gave them all kinds of extravagant names, and they played games with our faith. So one of the Sephirot they call God, and one they call Israel, and all sorts of other names. And so they made Israel, I think the rabbis of old would have torn their clothes if they heard such a thing, because it's blasphemy. But they said when we give edut, when we are testifying, we have to repeat the blasphemies so that everyone will know what they are. That's what they say. That when you juggle the words around, so you say that the thing called Tiferet has a cognomen, which is Israel. And another one, a lower one of the spheres, we call Shekhinah. And so Israel is greater than Shekhinah. Okay? It's pathetic, but that's what it says here. Come and see. Bed stands for the Shekhinah. As it is written, behold the bed of Solomon. What on earth has that to do with it? Anyway, the head of the bed is the foundation of the world, who or which is the head of the sacred couch. And that which is upon the head, the supernal, is Israel, who is established at the head of the bed. Hence, Israel bowed down to himself. Now, should you object that it was in fact the Shekhinah he bowed down to, at this point, he was not sick. For the next verse says, that means chapter 48, verse 1 says, sometime after this, Joseph was told, behold, your father is ill, which means that when he bowed, he was not yet ill. Well, that is correct. He said he was old and sick in the sense that he was frail, but he didn't have any specific illness. Then later, he became ill. That is true. So therefore, what are they arguing? Look at this sophistry. That's all you can call it. Because the Talmud said the Shekhinah is with the sick, so he is saying, since Jacob only became ill in the next verse, in fact, it says after some time, after that first visit of his son, on which occasion he bowed, only later does it say he became ill. So therefore, at the first visit of Joseph, his father was not ill, and therefore the Shekhinah was not there. Shekhinah only comes when a person is technically choleh. Since he wasn't at that point, there was no Shekhinah. Therefore, we know that he couldn't have been bowing to the Shekhinah. This is the argument. But because he knew that at the time he would rise to the supernal holy grade to become a perfect throne, therefore he bowed down to that supernal throne, the completion of the great and mighty tree, which was called by his name Israel, alias Tiferet. And so Israel bowed over the head of the bed, certainly to that which was over the head of the bed, for he or it had departed to his place and been crowned with the crown of the holy king. Hence, Israel bowed to Israel, bowed to himself. You see how the quibble works? We'll see more of this next time, because obviously it's very puzzling for anyone to understand what's going on here. Do you change the nature of something by giving it a fancy name. The substance doesn't change. So what do they think they were doing? Well, sorry to leave you in suspense, but as I said, I'm not going to say do justice. We can't do justice to it because there's no justice in any of this. This is like ramblings, with all due respect. Nevertheless, we do try to understand it as best we can on its own terms, and that we'll do next time. But now, let's end on a happier note, not on the note of the Zohar, but on the words of Maimonides. After Maimonides tells us that all these false prophets and all these priests were so successful in alluring people to their idolatry. One man, Abraham, was determined to turn back the tide. And while his success was not total, he certainly made a dent. And that's why we are here today. Thanks, of course, to God, but also to his wonderful messengers, beginning with Avraham Avinu. Thank you.
Does Hakham have time for questions?
You must ask the clock. Yes, I have.
Saku Baruch. Thank you. Hakham.
I pulled up this verse from Shir HaShiurim, and I was wondering if any other commentators ascribed, this kind of divine connection to Solomon's litter.
Well, we can't talk about that today. Actually, if you look at Midrash, Shir HaShiurim Rabbah, you'll find a difference of opinion, but we really can't go into it now. There's one opinion which says, Ine mitato shel Shlomo, melech shehashalom shelo. It doesn't refer to King Solomon, but to the king of peace, which seems to mean God. And then the next one says, I think it's, where is it? Chapter 3, I think. And then you'll have paragraphs 12 and 13, I think, say it was Melech Shalom Shiloh. And then you come to paragraph 14 in that same chapter of Midrash Shir HaShiurim, where it says, no, it's King Solomon. And very down to earth. He needed to safeguard himself, and therefore he had these strong men surrounding his bed. So you see two ways of understanding Shir HaShiurim. One makes it refer to King Solomon himself and nothing metaphysical, and the other two say it was something divine or whatever you want. So yes, does that answer your question?
Yes, and I did have one more. The Rambam text says, except for a few individuals, seeming to indicate that there was a small minority who maintained knowledge of God between Enosh and Avraham Avinu. Is there any tradition about who these people were, or if they somehow had contact with Avraham Avinu or taught him something?
Well, if you look at the Hebrew text, he names some. He gives examples like Noah and so on, and he names some. But I didn't think it was very important to do that because later on the Rambam will show that they did not have a great influence on their generation. They were individuals who were very insular, and they didn't go out and spread the word as Avraham Avinu did. So that's why he calls him the firm pillar, because he was strong enough with his convictions to go out and share it. Whereas the others, we're not saying they were selfish, but they didn't have the strength or the ability to make this dent. So That's why, though the Rambam lists them, he contrasts them very much with Avraham. Okay?
Are there any other questions for Hakham? Well, if there aren't any more questions, again, a tremendous Chazaku Baruch to the Hidri family and for sponsoring this shiur in honor of Miriam Bat Ahava. And if you yourself would like to sponsor shiur, please contact me directly. My email is there in the chat. If you have 27 hours still to make a tax-deductible donation in this fiscal year, so please go to tcomd.org/donations/Destination Torah to make a donation to Destination Torah. Again, that is all tax-deductible. If you would like to watch the predecessor to this shiur or any of the other shiurim, they are on YouTube and Facebook. So please share them, subscribe, you know, do whatever you can do to support Hakham that way. And lastly, Alatz Libi is available. So please email contributing editor Rabbi Steve Golden if you would like to purchase a copy of Hacham's Sidor Alatz Libi.
Okay. Good night, everyone.